Hi, I want to discuss today conjugations and macrons. Conjugations and macrons. They sort of go together. Not exactly, but in this video they do. A conjugation. Verbs are divided into conjugations. They're classified into conjugations. And the name of the conjugations are conjugations. Are you ready? This is tricky. Conjugations. You have verbs of the first conjugation, the second conjugation, the third conjugation, then we have a trick, third IO, and the fourth conjugation. At this point, we are only concerned with, and you've only been introduced to, verbs of the first and second conjugation. What does this mean? Do you remember one of the early on I was talking about teaching English, and I said if I were to teach English to people who didn't understand English, I would group various words together. I would group together the verbs that form their past tense simply by adding an ed. Looked, walked, biked. You add an ed to the end of the verb, and that's how you form the past tense. That would be one conjugation in English. And then you would have another grouping and another grouping and another grouping. This is exactly how it's done in Latin. Verbs of the first conjugation are verbs whose second principal part ends in an ARE. And verbs of the second conjugation are verbs that end in a long ERE. We are not going to concern ourselves at all with verbs of the third IO, and fourth. You don't need to worry about those right now. That said, some of you may have had Latin, and I will, just for the sake of completing this little chart here, introduce that. ERE is a sign of the third conjugation. Short ERE is the sign of the third, but the first principal part has an IO at the end, and the fourth is an IRE. This is how we group Latin verbs. And the words of the first and second conjugation have very different rules in some tenses from the third IO, and fourth. What do I mean by this? Amo, amare, amawi, amatum. This is the first conjugation because the second principal part ends in an ARE. Laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. That is a verb of the first conjugation because the second principal part ends in an ARE. Debeo, debere, debui, debitum. That is a verb of the second conjugation because the second principal part ends in a long ERE, just like habeo, habere, habui, habitum. The second principal part ends in a long ARE. This is what makes it the second conjugation. This is the only thing that makes it the second conjugation. Forget about the third principal part, the fourth principal part. I have happened to choose two words here that the third principal part follows a similar pattern. That's fine. It won't always. Just coincidence in this case. The first conjugation is completely, totally, utterly regular. They will all be amo, amare, amawi, amatum. The third and fourth principal parts are the same throughout. In fact, Wheelock at some point stops writing out all four principal parts of the first conjugation and just writes one. Amo, one. Laudo, one. Because the first conjugation is completely regular. The others are not. That doesn't mean you shouldn't learn all four principal parts. That just means the first conjugation is regular, and that's why we start with it. It wouldn't make sense to start with one of the more complicated ones that has different rules. So that is what is meant by conjugation. Right now you are being introduced to the first conjugation and the second conjugation, and the sign of that is a short AR, or is an ARE and a long ERE. Let's talk about a macron. A macron is the long mark. And there are two places where I will expect and insist that you use, and mark it wrong if you don't, use a long mark, use a macron. Number one, in the second principal part of a second conjugation verb. You must use it there. The second one you haven't hit yet, but I'll write it down just for consistency and we'll come back to it. In the ablative singular feminine of a first declension noun. Right. No, we haven't gotten there. Don't worry about it. We have gotten to the second principal part of the second conjugation verb. I know very well that Wheelock throughout uses other long marks, uses macrons throughout it. The reason it's so critical in this case is because habere has different words, different rules than capere. Notice how I said those. Habere, with a long mark, it has the emphasis too. Habere versus capere. And habere in origin would have taken longer to say. That habere would have been like two E's. It is longer. Capere is shorter. It makes all the difference in the world, and that's why you need to memorize those two. Wheelock does include a long A over the first conjugation, but we're not concerned about that. And the reason we're not concerned about that is it's not going to get confused with anything else in Latin. Amare is always going to be amare. There's no difference between amare and I hate to write it down because there's no difference between. You're not going to get this confusion that you get with the second and third. You will not get the confusion with an ARE. And again, from the first slide, the first thing I wrote down, the second is an ERE, a long ERE, and the third is a short ERE. You've just got to memorize it. What's the best way to memorize it? Funny you asked. I would take out 2 sheets of paper and I would start immediately. One piece of paper, write first conjugation. Second piece of paper, write second conjugation. Hey, and guess what? When we get to the third IO and the fourth conjugation, you're going to have a few more pieces of paper, and that's okay. There's only 5 conjugations. And you are going to go through your vocabulary. Pretend on this screen that there are 2 pieces of paper. And you're going to go through the verbs in the vocabulary and say, oh, amo, amare, amawi, amatum. Oh, good, that's amo, amare. That's a first conjugation verb. Amatum. And had this been a full-size sheet of paper, I could have written it all out, but I didn't. I insist as much as I can that you do. I hate it that I've created a bad example. I'll move past it though. Laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. I compensated. Debeo, I get to. Oh, debeo. Debeo is a second conjugation verb. Debeo, debere, debui, debitum. Again, if you're using a full sheet of paper, you're not going to run out of room like I have. I've had to, for the sake of explaining it to you, I've had to take some shortcuts that I resent, that I don't like, but that's okay. I don't want to set a bad example. I want you to do this. Take 2 sheets of paper and separate out your verbs. That's it. Do that. Now, when you get to chapter 2, you're going to continue this trend. Get to chapter 2. And let me be clear. Only things that are conjugated, that you split this way, are verbs. Verbs are the only things that have first conjugations. Later on, not too far on, I mean, next chapter, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to get nouns that have declensions, and nouns will be divided also. And I'm going to suggest you do the same thing for that. But starting here, starting today, starting right now, separate your verbs in this manner. 1 sheet of paper for first conjugation and another sheet of paper for second conjugation. That will pay off. Thanks.